Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with Dr. Daniel Tutt to discuss one of his latest books, The Psychoanalysis and Politics of the Family, The Crisis of Initiation. Daniel Tutt is an American philosopher with a focus in psychoanalytic theory and Marxist thought, and an adjunct professor of philosophy at George Washington University. I'm really excited for this conversation, Daniel, because I think it's super important to bring both psychoanalytic and Marxist thought to the topic of the family. And so when I saw you'd written a book on it, I was like, we've got to dive in on this. Welcome to the show and happy to have you here.
Great to be here. Yeah, I love it. It's I'm a huge fan of the channel, so it's exciting. I'm going to be attending your Acree course, which also looks great. So this is a real blessing to be here. And thanks for your interest in the book and in the topic. Happy to answer any questions and brainstorm and kind of think through. I mean, one of the cool things about the book is that it's such a vast topic that it has elicited a lot of exchanges and panels and dialogues, and a few people are writing essays based on it. So it's been very generative as a project, even for my own research. I'm always I mean, part of what my objective was to stake out a kind of theoretical repertoire of ideas and concepts so that we can turn a light onto the question of the family. So in that sense, I have like a glossary of concepts in the book, which you may have seen at the end. And I'm trying to sort of use the tools of psychoanalysis to clarify sort of the stakes of the question of the family. Is the family a big question for me is the family compatible with, or how is it compatible with left-wing socialist politics, right? That's a huge debate that I've had the fortune to have with other left-wing thinkers and across the spectrum, from anarchist to communist and to liberal, right? Because I do think that there's a bit of confusion and neglect into this topic. And then another thing I'll say is that one of the things I discovered in writing the book was, of course, that psychoanalysis in the theory of Oedipus is, you can't think Oedipus without a serious analysis of the family as a socio-historical construct. So it's sort of necessary to understand what the contemporary socio-material makeup of the family is in order to do psychoanalytic theory. And I think that someone like Jacques Lacan was very aware of that, by the way. And then the other thing that I really discovered in the book was the notion of ideology, which I think in post-Althusserian thought and Žižekian thought, we have a very particular theory of ideology. But in the line of inquiry that I have in the second chapter of my book, I try to point to a different theory of ideology, and the way that in capitalist society, the family functions as an ideological machine. So those are just a couple immediate thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic opening. And before diving into like the specific contents of the book that were standing out to me, I would be very interested in some of the things you're seeing being generated either through writing essays or conversations specifically about the book. What are some of the things it's provoking all the way from one end of the spectrum of the left to the other end of the spectrum, whether it's anarchist, communist, liberal? What are you seeing? What has the major reaction been, or some responses that stand out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one is with the socialist, feminist, and what's called the family abolition left. Now, family abolition is a controversial and interesting lineage of left-wing practice and thought. Part of the dialogue that I've had has been with that community of thinkers and activists, and that has generated some really robust debates that, frankly, are interesting, not so much as debates, but as what I would call kind of like preliminary dialogues, which don't ever really occur. And the reason that those dialogues or exchanges don't occur is because if you think about it, the position of family abolition is so radical that for most people, even on the left, it becomes a non-starter. So there's never a discussion across that bridge. It's kind of siloed. So I've had 2 or 3 events. One of them was at a very prestigious, the American Psychoanalytic Association, the APA, which is, a very prestigious. It was the first panel on family abolition held at the American Psychoanalytic Association, and I was speaking there. And the other speakers were actually all our age, kind of, millennial age theoreticians and psychoanalytic practitioners, and they were sort of adopting this support for the notion of family abolition. I mean, we can just describe what that means. It's not immediately evident when people say family abolition. It seems kind of strange. I don't know about you or your viewers, what you think of it. But anyways, I take a kind of diplomatic and critical perspective on family abolition. I'm quite critical of it. I'm not a I'm for the kind of historical literacy about it, coming out of Marxism, coming out of the Communist Manifesto, and understanding how it has evolved over time. So that's one dimension that has been productive. The other dimension is in my 3rd chapter on this concept of social superego. I've had several events, one at the Lacan Culture Clinic and Culture Conference at Duquesne. There was a panel dedicated to the book there, where one of the authors is doing a literary study of like 19th century literature and incorporating this idea of the social superego, which is sort of, I guess you could say it's sort of like my concept in a certain way. It's kind of my attempt to make a more historically rigorous understanding of social authority. We can describe that at a later time, perhaps, but those are 2 examples. I think the third has been a conversation on the class composition of family structures today. This is an interesting one. Often, when we talk about families, we really have a tendency just to talk about one family, or kind of like, oh, like the family. And what we mean by that, in an underhanded sense, is like the middle class family ideal, right? However, in my book, I try to differentiate between what I call a working class and a middle class family as kind of 2 distinct for material reasons, but also distinct, frankly, as experiential ways of relating to the family. Like, and here I pull from a lot of like working class studies and sociological studies on the contemporary family, as well as the historical family of the bourgeois or middle class family from the 19th century, for which we get the middle class family. And I kind of do a historical genealogy of that. But it's very important to me to throw onto the table, in our era, in our time, in the neoliberal era, the fact that some people experience the family in a highly precarious way, and that the forces that animate that precarity are driven by class disadvantage, class inequality, and so on. And so part of my objective there was to build a certain literacy so that people can begin to feel more at ease with talking about class difference. Because I believe that politics needs to center class difference in all of its heterogeneity and all of its the different ways that it appears, not in any kind of class reductionist way, but I'm a class, I guess you could say I'm a class firstist, not a class reductionist. But also with that, I'm an advocate for rendering class more thorough, concentrating more on its heterogeneity, its expressions, and its different modes of power. I'm also of the mind that Marxist theory and critical theory has actually abandoned the class question for a long time. So that's the third area of discussion that I think has emerged from this work.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I hope we can get in this podcast a deeper understanding of the way you're developing the concept of the superego, because I do think that question of the historicity of authority is super important. And maybe we can go into the cracks of that later in the conversation. But where I want to start is I think there's a link here that I wanted to open up with that does, I think, tie in with the family abolitionist sort of sentiment. Now, I'm assuming, and from people I've talked to, I've met some people who take that position. Usually it's sort of a perspective that the family is over constraining and that there's too much constraints on concepts of individuation, too much constraints on concepts of normativity, too much constraints on what it means to be free. And you open the book with this question, or you point in the direction of this question of, why is the politics of the family so important for a broader conception of liberation? And I like that sort of way of thinking, is that when we think about freedom, oftentimes, and here myself, let me just bring it in personally, because that will feel more real to me, is I feel like I've privileged my creative drive and I've privileged my academic drive over family in a traditional conception or in a normative conception. And when I do think about what steps, what sacrifices it would take to build a family in the context of neoliberal historicity, I do feel overwhelmed by that. And I think that I'm not alone there. I think there's many people in my situation, roughly, who might confront similar emotions. But I like the way in which you're raising the question, at least provoking me to think about how family can actually be an integral part of thinking about liberation over the course of my life as a whole, for example. So what are you trying to provoke there, and where are your thoughts now about this this intersection between liberation and family?
Yes, great point. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, you have an interesting cultural phenomenon, which maybe touches on the Freudian theory of the superego, which is this idea, touches on both class and superego, which I'm sure you've heard of this idea, which is that red diaper babies, or people, children that are raised in households that are kind of bourgeois or middle class, highly educated and very left wing, actually paradoxically have a tendency to produce children that are more integrated into the normative authority of the status quo, right? So like, you think of Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris, both raised by Marxist professors, right? But both, like, staunch, not leftists, but kind of authoritarian liberals, right? And of course, they might call themselves progressive, but as a Marxist, we know that is a bit of an illusion to say that. I'm very much, as a Marxist, on the line that that one can be a progressive liberal and be an excellent advocate of the status quo, and actually paradoxically be quite conservative, therefore. Just to give you a sense of how I view politics. But to get to your point, I mean, I think there has been a sense that patriarchal authority has weakened. There's a kind of narrative that we've inherited from the New Left, right? And the New Left is that kind of 60s and 70s, which is very much a middle class form of politics. It gave us the sexual revolution. It gave us the cultural revolution in the West. There's much to be said about the New Left. One of the kind of points that it tended to say about the family was that the family needed to be reformed, but its reform led to the sexual revolution. It led to a kind of greater sense of expansion of gender roles, a greater introduction of women into the market economy, into labor, into wage labor, etc. Whether the wage and the market has lifted the egalitarian potential of women is a whole other story. But the argument was that the family had kind of evolved into a repressive patriarchal breadwinner structure. Now, of course, that breadwinner structure introduces a bit of a kind of paradox, I would say, in the sense that today, no one is quite permitted to advocate for the return of a breadwinner structure, even though the breadwinner structure had many merits. The biggest merit of the breadwinner structure of the family is the question of leisure time. So one of the things that I center, right, which I think that the New Left tended to miss out on, by the way, is that a radical conception of the family that actually stretches back to the 19th century is a family that centers leisure time. Okay. And that is a resurrection of an old idea. That's an old idea that I think we should recenter in contemporary politics. Okay. Is a family as a kind of haven in a heartless world, to use Christopher Lash's term. A family as a kind of a vessel that can help its members subtract from the degradations of the market economy. In a paradoxical sense, today's family is thrown into the levers and the gears of the market and is kind of instrumentalized in such a way that they cannot quite escape commodification. But actually, what I try to show is that historically the family was and has and can be thought as a refuge from commodification, right? So that's one point. Now, another point I want to say regarding the point that you made about yourself and your own narrative, which is interesting, is that, you know, if you study the working class family from the 1950s through the 1970s, and you look at the literature, the sociological literature on it, you'll notice an interesting dynamic, which is the romance and the matrimony rites that people would follow, let's say just heterosexuals as an example, in terms of getting married, was itself fascinating because it tended to be completely non-instrumentalized. In other words, if you were to ask a working class man and woman, why did you choose your partner? I don't know if you're aware of this, but most of the time they would not be able to give an answer that would be instrumentalized, i.e. that would be linked to a market logic. In other words, it would not have anything to do with Cadell's earning potential or his, capacity to provide for me, et cetera, et cetera. Which is why what you had at that time, in a very, I think, positive sense, was non-assertative marriage, okay, which was marriage cross-class, more so. Now, if you think about the health of a society, and from the standpoint of class, okay, it may not be immediately evident to you, but I would make the argument that a non-assertative marriages where you have people from rich backgrounds marrying people from poor backgrounds and everything in between, that variance, that heterogeneity, that actually produces a healthy social order, okay? That's actually, since the late 1970s till now, that has not been what has been happening. That, so people are, in a sense, marrying rigidly within their class. And this, I think, poses a major problem, okay? Again, this goes back to my class literacy objective in the book, right? To at least be able to point that out. And the other thing I'll say, and I'll stop here, is that at this point in time, the rites and the protocols of matrimony and marriage have become so overly commodified, so overly marketized, that to use a phrase from Eva Illouz, who's a sociologist who wrote an incredible book called The End of Love, she argues that this commodification, this marketization, is creating a process of what she calls unloving. Unloving, which is basically a way in which people are now opting out of even experimenting in the matrimony marriage possibility. I'm not even talking about children and family. I'm just talking about the possibility of marriage. And because it's become so instrumentalized. So I would argue we're reaching a crisis point. We're reaching a crisis point with this, especially exacerbated by post-2008 crisis dynamics. I mean, most economists, I think, argue that post-2008 has been a kind of normalization of a crisis economy, right? It's kind of one crisis after the other, and they sort of spill and bleed into one another in a certain sense. So my question is to ask, in those contexts, how might we re-envision the family, right? I think it's also an invitation in that regard.
Yeah, I actually, that stuck out to me was your point in the book that quote from Lash, "Haven in a heartless world," stuck out to me, because I think more and more, and this might connect sort of already full circle with your thought, is this emergence of a unloving society, that people and here I think it's because we're talking about family, why not just keep on bringing in at least some connection to the personal narrative, is that I think a lot of people that I know and a lot of people that I sort of source experience and as well as my own start to feel like even the family is not anymore that haven. Like they just feel like we're just in a heartless world now, and now we don't even have the family as a haven from the heartless world. But I think that if we are to start to reconceptualize the nature of the family, wherever we are on the political spectrum, certainly creating this haven in a heartless world is, from my understanding, a good place to start. And that does resonate with me in my experience as well. Another thing that resonates with my experience is what you were talking about on regards to the class rigidity in marriage, is that I've actually had that experience. I've had the experience of having a partner who is in a different class and her parents forbidding the relationship on the basis of class.
Wow.
So that is a literally happened. But I mean, just as a symptom of what you're saying is like, I do feel like it makes a lot of sense to say post 2008, we've got this normalization of a crisis, of which one of these symptoms is an increasing class rigidity, probably because there's a feeling like if you're marrying in between class, there's no possibility for upward mobility from the person coming from the lower class. And this is seen as a threat. You're even seen as a stain. You're seen.
This is amazing. No, I mean, that's incredible. That's an incredible testimony.
The exact,
please.
like before you continue, but I just want to say that the actual example that sticks out the most from that experience was I had a crappy car and they didn't want me to park it on that street. They didn't want me to park my car but just like the view is basically that you're a stain. And again, there's a very rigid distinction between the two. But so I don't know if you have anything you want to elaborate on that.
Oh, well, I mean, so many thoughts. I mean, I really appreciate that insight and you sharing. I mean, this is another beauty of writing on the family, which I didn't expect this to happen, but kind of allowing people to have dialogues where they can allow for the theoretical to interweave with the personal in this kind of tapestry, which I feel that if you were to write on other topics, it might not allow it, right? So that actually has a kind of collective, perhaps that is a kind of a collective way to point a light towards a kind of collective therapeutic intervention that could be made. It's not to say that we're doing collective therapy right now, but it's something that is elevating a certain consciousness, which I think is valuable, and helping people also see things in a new way. Because if the left, right, has a position of a staunch and a hardcore family abolition position, and that it is actually perceived, if you're going to be a leftist, you must toe this line. Well, part of what I wanted to do in the book is to throw an olive branch to allow for difference to emerge within that milieu. And that's not to say that one must become a post-leftist or reject the left or say this is silly or asinine. It's rather, again, to start this dialogue around building a kind of conception, a literacy. So part of my book is sort of building a kind of ground floor of a kind of new literacy on these matters. And also, I think, is understanding the historical way that these dynamics play out, like the assertative marriage piece. And on that, my conception here is that it's so fascinating that class is such a palpable part of our everyday life, but it is the most depoliticized domain of political life, if you think about it. Class is not really permitted to become or emerge into a politicized signifier that organizes people according to its logics. And that, I think, is because there's been a certain victory on behalf of hegemonic liberalism. It's an ideological problem, right? It's an education problem. right? It's also, I think, owed to other dynamics. I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book on the history of liberalism, and I try to argue that this ideology of algerism has, in American context in particular, and then later meritocracy, also contributed to the depoliticization of class, right? Because I know so many people from working class backgrounds for whom it's really difficult for them to conceive even A, of that experience as distinct or unique, and B, to move from that to a politicized embrace of it. It's very difficult to do. So part of my my work, and this will be like my life's work really, is to try to answer that question in some sense. And by the way, to do that in such a way where you're making an argument about class that will satisfy in a more thorough way the anxieties that liberals have about class, which is what? Which is, you're talking about white working class, you're not talking about race, you're not talking about gender, you're not talking about other oppressed groups. I think that that actually is a misnomer, and that we need to prove that that's a misnomer, that the kind of profound diversity of the working class as it exists, already contains within it these various expressions, and that from within that there doesn't need to be a sense that within the working class there must be a kind of professional policing on how they deal with the diversity of the trans experience, race issues, etc., etc. That from within the working class base, socialist politics should prioritize. It's not exclusively, my vision would not be exclusive to that, but it would be prioritizing that experience for strategic reasons, for reasons having to do with my understanding of Marxist and socialist practice, right? So I think that there needs to be a grand revisitation of the class question. I think you're catching my drift here. I don't know if you agree with that, but this is sort of where the kind of conclusion of my book draws us to, that I think kind of we've ignored it for a long time. And I think that the abandonment of the working class as the revolutionary agent has had detrimental effects. I think it's had detrimental effects. I mean, we can talk about that, but that's my general view.
Okay, well, yeah, I want to connect that. So I'd like to ask a question which is related to this. You know, you stating your class first, not class reductionist, but class first. And in the context of this grand revisitation of class, I mean, the concept that I came across a lot, for example, in Zizek's work with the proletariat, was the concept of rabble. I don't know what you think about rabble, but maybe throw that word out there and see what it means to you. Also, with the left today, with the emphasis on gender and race, there's this emphasis on the concept of multiplicity as well, which might be another signifier which has some relationship to the grand revisitation of class. And the other thing is, you already mentioned the new left of the 60s and the 70s, the countercultural revolution being so important in sort of making certain advances that I'm sure many of us would like to preserve and deepen even. But also, I think, confront this paradox, which you bring up in the book, which I think is a super important paradox to think, which you call, I think, the paradox of liberation, as it relates to superego dynamics that, and I think you stated it very well, paraphrasing, saying, any liberationist upsurge will be greeted by superegoic mechanisms. And I think that's a super important concept to unpack, because I think there's a lot of movements which do have this emancipatory, they romanticize the original moment of the origin of a movement, where you don't have to deal with the liberationist upsurge, right, where you don't have to deal with any superegoic mechanism. And always the idea is that our liberationist upsurge will get rid of the superegoic mechanisms. We're not going to produce superegoic mechanisms. Yeah. But I think, how do we think about this in a more historically rich dynamic? Yes.
All right. So let's address this rabble class question. I mean, I think from a Marxist point of view, one way to approach this question would be, what's your theory of revolution? Is your theory of revolution a cultural one primarily, which is fine. There's no problem with cultural revolution. It's valuable. I think within that, though, it's interesting because that also, you can't ever really escape class in Marxist analysis, in political analysis, I would say, because you can have a bourgeois or a proletarian version of cultural revolution. And I think that the truth is that capitalism is always undergoing a capitalist cultural revolution, right? And a theory that I have been drawn to lately by two German philosophers who wrote an incredible book called Public Sphere and Experience, Kluge and Knecht. They argue that we can understand fascism and reactionary politics as the failure of the working class to provide a relief from the degradation and the alienation that constant subjection to wage labor produces for the working class. And they argue that that is the task of what they call proletarian cultural revolution, which is to provide a kind of sphere of life which offers a kind of capacity for the proletariat to come into touch with a conception of the totality, to come into touch, to be able to articulate the alienation that they experience. Because capitalism can already do that quite well. We know this through consumerism, through the commodification of entertainment and so on. Think here of Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry as a great proof of that, of the kind of depoliticization of alienation under capitalism, right? I think Adorno and Horkheimer take that a bit too far because they end up arguing in a post-war situation. In part, they argue this, by the way, because they thought that the working class made a kind of pact with the Nazis in Germany. So they argue that the revolutionary agency of the working class is a danger, presents a danger. But I think actually in reality, if we look at the kind of trajectory of how left-wing movements have gone in the era of the last few decades, which has witnessed a kind of de-emphasis on class, we see that revolutionary activities don't quite succeed. They become reformist, they become captured by bourgeois parties. And so the emphasis on working class would be that the subjectivity, the interests, the motivations of the proletariat, as defined primarily through class, etc., which we can drill that down more, is going to allow for a left-wing movement to more thoroughly revolutionize the mode of production. That is what I understand to be the kind of core Marxist idea of revolution as a revolution in the mode of production. So I think that kind of wager should be brought back onto the table. Now, that, and at the same time, does not negate the new left, multiplicity, celebration of difference, etc. I think it rather centers not just class, but rather labor power. So I think the important distinction I wish to make clear here would be that it's not so much I wish to center the static position of factory workers or a particular stratum of workers. Rather, it's to center the labor power of collective working class agents in such a way that is truly transformative to the capital labor relation. If socialist thought, socialist practice is not interested in transcending capitalism, right, is not serious about that, then I think what you have is a kind of cultural revolutionary left that kind of oscillates and never progresses. So if we want to get serious, I think we would have to think about things through centering of a concept of labor power. And to do that, you need to think hard about the class question. So my end would be more about this contestation at the level of labor power. And I think with that also means a revisitation, and this is a lot of work I've been doing lately, of how contemporary Marxists from French theory, from the influence of Althusser and Poulancis and Marxist state theory and all of these different domains of contemporary Marxist thought, Laclau and Mouffe, to a certain extent, Zizek, although he's a little bit of a different case, have kind of wavered, I think, from a more robust conception of socialist philosophy. So that's kind of a direction of my work in the longue durée, in the future. But in essence, yeah, I think that we need to center a conception of the proletariat which privileges class and especially labor. That would be my position. I know there's a lot to unpack from that, but just to give you, and this could be a future conversation as well.
Yeah. No, and I hope we're gonna. I would love to draw this out into a series on the family, and I think there's so much here that we should take our time with and not rush through necessarily. But the first thing that's coming up there, the main distinction I'm drawing from that is this distinction of cultural revolution and labor revolution. Culture as first, labor as first.
But you would call it a political revolution in the sense that the distinction would be between political and cultural revolution, but the means by which to achieve a political revolution would have to center labor power as a first priority.
Okay.
That would be the argument, and
Okay.
that and then now within Marxism, there are different schools of thought regarding whether cultural revolution and political revolution can happen at the same time, whether you can only have, like, for example, in Lenin was actually very conservative on the two. And he argued against Bogdanov that cultural revolution should be controlled by the intelligentsia and prolonged until we have had a more adequate break with capitalism. This is a big debate within Leninism, actually. Now, Mao, as you know, at some point, in order to solve the deadlocks of the political revolution, opened up the cultural revolution, right? So there's a long history there of this. It's almost a bit of a dialectic between political and cultural revolution that I think is very interesting. I think the family there, I mean, let's take a step back. In the long duration of 20th century up to the present, the family around the world, from China, Russia, Europe, Africa, United States, etc., has been the most inflexible, the least prone to change, even in the context of revolutionary situations. So the family, in a paradoxical sense, is a kind of a bit like Gumby, you know? It can kind of flexibly move, but its core integrity actually doesn't change, which I think means something, that even though we face these dynamics, which we were talking about before, of like people refusing marriage or opting out of marriage or waiting to marry or having very precarious experiences, there still is nonetheless a kind of intuitive desire, I think, amongst people for the reproduction of the family. That's going to exist in communist, capitalist, so, you know, any social order is going to have this. One of the things that we also know, I'm thinking here of Goran Theborn's incredible work on the history of the family in the 20th century, is that speaking about socialism and the new left, not those dynamics, do you know what the number one most expansive source for the egalitarian advancement of the family was in the 20th century? Without question, it was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. In part because what that allowed for was a spillover eventually to China, right, in its eventual communist revolution, that fundamentally made the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the rights of gender non-normative expression. I mean, Stalin set it back, but when it opened up a whole new set of possibilities, that the sexual revolution in the West would not have been possible even without that, according to Thorbjørn, who's a great Marxist sociologist. So what I'm trying to say is that the family is kind of at the nexus of both political and cultural revolution, right? It is the heart of capitalist social life. And it's in a sense, the notion of abolishing the family is interesting also because there have been several attempts by left-wing movements, communist movements, to push a kind of non-bourgeois, commune-oriented form of family making. And I think in large part, they have not really succeeded in an interesting way. There tends to be, so there needs to be some sort of serious thinking about whether we can even call the private, because, you know, the definition of the bourgeois family is interesting because it actually has its origin in property, right? It's largely about, I mean, part of it was interesting because even proletarians, and I'm talking 19th century proletarians, they had to fight for the rights to have a family, even though they're deprived of property. So that actually introduced a new qualitative experience of the family for the working class, which you can have a family, but not own property, right? In other words, you can have half or under half of what the promise of the middle class family is. And in that limited experience that you're given, kind of like you think about like a dog at the dinner table and you're given scraps. That's like the working class family, they're given a few scraps. Well, historically, the scraps that they've been given, what they built with that at an experiential level was liberatory. That's my contention. And that goes back to this question of, can a family be revolutionary? And I would say it depends on the context in the historical milieu. If you look at a certain period in European history, 19th century, yeah, I think you had a proletarian family that was quite radical. And even if you study the French Revolution and you study, because part of what the French Revolution did was fundamentally not abolish the peasantry, but fundamentally reform the peasantry. And the family politicization of peasantry in French Revolution, which led to the activation of the Jacobins and the kind of all of the different dimensions of the radical parts of French, that was not driven by individual self-interest alone. In many cases, it was driven by a concerted family desire for the transcendence of their material conditions. Because you think about it like that, like families can also formulate a liberatory sense of interest, right? Because interest doesn't have to always be reducible to a highly instrumentalized commodity sense of interest, right? Like Lenin teaches this, right? Like there's proletarian interest that can be revolutionary, right? So could we envision that conception of interest on behalf of a family? And I think it's possible. I think it's possible to do that.
Yeah,
I don't know if you agree.
there's a number of threads there that I'd like to follow and that are coming up in my mind. So just going back, this main distinction being the cultural or the political. And actually, you know, I was just teaching What is Sex with David McCarricker of Theory Underground, and one of the main through lines throughout that entire course that we emphasized again and again is that Alenka is basically trying to put the sexual and the political into a higher order conversation, that she's saying, you know, the psychoanalytic discovery of the unconscious, the importance of sexuality can't be understood independent of the political context and the political ramifications of these concepts, that the specific idea of the unconscious has political consequences, and she works towards that throughout the book. So I think that you're also, you know, foregrounding here the political is an important move that we should think with and work with. And I also sort of stuck out to me in what you were saying was this way in which, independent of the political economy, there's this, you say, Gumby like structure of the family. It's kind of, there's a core integrity there, and that's especially interesting to think about in the context of where we started the conversation of family abolition. It's like this idea, I almost get this sense of the family abolitionists being like trying to use symbols to get rid of the real, like to exercise the real from its place, which can't be exercised from its place. Like it's going to stay right where it is. But then I was thinking about something, you know, I wanted to ask you about this anyway, is that could be a lead in here to the liberatory sense of the family. And maybe what's at stake in the left thinking, again, the family, is you say the family in psychoanalytic theory is, this was really powerful, is overloaded with identifications and affects. So if the family is this Gumby-like structure, which is kind of, it's in its place, we should try to work with it, and work with it in a liberatory drive, in a political sense. At the same time, we have certain aspects of theory which are trying to abolish the family. Could it be because the family is a site that's overloaded with identifications and affects, that there's so much negative emotions, there's so much feeling like the family and the images associated with the family, the imaginary dimension of the family, which is perhaps in some people's minds preventing me from being free. I have to get away from the family. I have to get away from these identifications. I have to get away from these affects in order to feel free.
Yeah.
What's coming up in your head here?
Yeah, no, it's really subtle. It's a bit of a tautology, perhaps, on behalf of psychoanalysis, in the following sense. Psychoanalysis has a tendency to invent concepts for which it is the only remedy, for which its method provides the only remedy. And I think this is the same thing with the theory of Oedipus. This is the famous notion of the double bind of Oedipus. And I think what I mean specifically is that, well, Freud says that the task of part of the outcome of a successful psychoanalytic cure will also be the remediation of paternal dependencies which exist beyond the Oedipal stage. So it's actually a big question around whether the Oedipal stage recurs in one's life. And some argue that it does, that there's a kind of repetition of the same binds and ambivalent attachments that you had developed in early infancy and beyond. And this is what Lacan argues the function of the father is. He says that the function of the father for the child at the later stage of Oedipus is to basically grant a permission so that the subject can invent a new jouissance, right? When that permission of the father is ineffective or is not responsive or inefficacious, the subject experiences a kind of Oedipal stunting, right? Now, one of the arguments that I work with in the book, which you probably saw, which is not exactly a Lacanian idea, might I add, is the thesis of pre-Oedipality. And now, what does that mean? What that refers to is an argument that consumer-era capitalism, in part because it has eroded the bonds of the family and weakened the stability of the family, weakened the capacity of this Oedipal process of letting go of attachments and ambivalence and so on, because that has been weakened, you have this is a Christopher Lasch line of argumentation, which I'd like to see what you think about it. You have emerged, right? A problem over the transition from primary to secondary narcissism. You have a problem that results in an increase in aggressive identifications. You have a problem of affect. You have shame proliferate. You have a whole set of kind of sad passions in a Spinoza's sense tend to proliferate. And what I try to show is that Horkheimer, in his book on the family, made an argument that when you have a healthy relationship to authority within the family, and when the family is stabilized, you can overcome these dependencies. That's a successful Oedipal process. Okay. So I think that there's something to this. I think that there is, I don't want to oversell the idea because I think that it's not true that everyone is a narcissist or everyone is experiencing pre-Oedipal. No, that's not true. That's too strong. I rather like to say that as it's a cultural tendency for which we can point to specific symptoms and specific lines of its occurrence. Okay, so it's a theory that has some compelling evidence, right? And in other cases it doesn't. Okay. So in that sense, what I try to show is that, yes, psychoanalysis is essential for understanding a different theory of abolition of the family, if you like. Because the family abolitionists, you're right, are a bit like the true socialists that Marx and Engels critique in the Communist Manifesto, who wanted socialism as a kind of abolition of bad ideas, or it's almost, in a paradoxical sense, it's overly idealist, because many of the family abolitionists want the ratification of the father as such. What does that even mean? I mean, it's kind of goes back to this point that the family is the most Gumby-like institution. How could you extricate something like that? And A, and then B, what would the psychic effects be on subjects if you really did that? Now that's not to fetishize fathers or something like that, but it's rather, I think, to pay homage to Lacan's point that there has been a waning of the traditional bourgeois father. There has been a kind of destabilization of his place within the family. And this has given rise to a pluralization of the father function. So in that sense, that late Oedipal stage, it's not the biological father that initiates the subject into the invention of a new jouissance. No, Lacan's whole point is that it happens through mentors, through a boss, through, I don't know, somebody that you look up to, right? So this idea of the father as an abstract concept to be destroyed doesn't make sense if you adopt a Lacanian view of what a father is, because the father is much more than just the biological father. I mean, that's a whole other debate. That's a whole other debate as to whether you need the biological father to mediate past traumas. And this is a huge thing for me around the rabble. This is where the question of rabble comes in, because yes, we have working class as a subjectivity that I think we need to politically center, but amongst the working class, more and more, we have emerged what in Marxist class theory is called lumpenization, which is a kind of the negative effects of neoliberal precarity affecting the working class subjects. And I think that this has led to fractured families that are, experiencing like abandonment issues, all those sorts of subjects, what I call of counter initiation, subjects for whom they're basically cast off. The social contract of the family is not available to them. Those subjects interest me a lot. And one of the things in the book that I try to ask is, can we think rabble subjects, to use your word, as revolutionary? Marx and Engels were kind of split on that question, right? You know, they called the lumpen proletariats scoundrels and knaves, right? And then they said that within the lumpen, within the rabble, there's some honest and there's some scoundrels. So that's a real question, for me. Now, I think a lot of the new left has done a strange thing, perhaps, which is they've abandoned the working class and they've only focused on the rabble, right? So I think what we need to do is focus on both, and we need to show that within the working class, you already see a new composition emerge where the working class now is already lumpenized. And often when you see composition of real working class experience, it's so heterogeneously composed of lumpen and traditional working class elements that they bleed into each other, right? And I say that anecdotally, but also based on sociological realities.
Well, let me start by sort of bringing it back to that point of Oedipal stunting and the Christopher Latch idea of primary and secondary narcissism. And I just want to sort of emphasize that the dominant experience of my life throughout my doctorate to the present has been sort of seeing the way in which society at large is becoming structured by this increase in aggressive identifications, this increase in sad affects that you're saying, a proliferation of this. And I do see it as tied to crises of authority, broadly speaking, and also a much more expanded notion of what the father is, not the biological father, but much more in the direction of a problem and a crisis of mentors and the invention of new jouissance, like you were saying. I think that maps very nicely into what I've seen. And it actually is, I would say, the primary location within which I started getting loosely involved in men's work. So I've been involved, for example, in what's called the European Men's Network. They do certain initiation rites, like literally the gathering is to, in some sense, virtually simulate the death of the killing of the father. Like that, literally have a weekend where this is simulated.
Right. No, that's incredible. I mean, it's always a big question in Lacan and in other psychoanalytic thought regarding this right of the transcendence of the father of the horde. Now, one of the things I've realized about Freud's theory of paternity is that, and this has really challenged, I think, a lot of feminists, which is that, you could read Freud to the letter and arrive at a pretty radical feminist conclusion, right? Because what he's basically saying is that it's necessary to repetitively confront and overcome the patriarchal father, right? This is a necessity. This is a practice, right? And that the basis of modern society, the possibility of civility, the possibility of democracy, the possibility of kind of having like reason animate sociality, let's say, is tied into this necessity, right? So a society which has not addressed that question, because that's actually an interesting thing apropos our conversation of family abolition. Because one thing you could respond to family abolitionists is to say, well, actually, what we're doing is a form of abolition. Yeah, it's a different symbolic mediation form. We're coming at it from a different angle, but the effects are liberatory. Does that make sense? So that would be one interesting response. Like you almost would have to say, like, well, actually, psychoanalysis teaches us that it's not to be construed as a literal thing. It's a kind of symbolic initiatory process that we in our culture have less avenues to, or we have less means to do it. And the other point would be in that our culture, because of that, actual empirical fathers face what Lacan called the experience of humiliation. I mean, there's this incredible French playwright that Lacan was obsessed with called Paul Claudel. And he was a Catholic conservative playwright, but he wrote a trilogy of plays on the status of fathers, and you could say of manhood, in modernity. And these are like classic. He's one of the best playwrights of the 20th century. And when Lacan talks about how the condition of the father, of any father, is always to be humiliated, and when Lacan says that the father, or when Freud says that the child is the father to the man, what that actually indicates is an incredibly brilliant insight that Lacan picked up from Freud, which is that in order for the new jouissance to be developed, there actually needs to be an envy that doesn't go from son to father, but from father back to son. And that's an interesting paradox that Lacan and Freud open for us. And I have a whole section in my book on the relationship between father to son rivalry, and how that plays out. We don't need to get to that today, perhaps, but you really reminded me of that. And I actually want to hear more about this experience that you're talking about. Could you say more about it, actually?
Yeah. So basically, where I started to get into this was kind of, I think it comes to this impasse that you were talking about, is that we have less avenues to this metaphorical killing of the father. As a result of that, I think that there's this proliferation of negative affects that you were talking about. Now, that brought me to now I never got into this ideologically, like in terms of like wanting to identify as a man or something like that. It more came from affective disturbances. But where it led me was, yeah, this European men's network where there's a lot of circling, but there's also a lot of organization towards what it takes to either build a business or maturation processes or exploring religious pathways. But the overall, what happens at the actual meetings, what happens at the actual festivals, is basically a simulation of it's basically providing that avenue that we're not getting in society, of where you can simulate killing the father. So the whole week, you are doing these, you're toiling, you're working, doing jobs that you don't want to do. For us, it was just mindless labor of putting rocks here and there. And then you go to lunch, and when you come back, the father has destroyed your work. So you're supposed to be upset and you have to do it again. But there's all of this buildup of negative tension throughout the week against this figure, which is put in the position of the king or the patriarch. And then it builds up to all of the men becoming warriors. So like you go through warrior training, you're doing all of these physical rituals. You're also processing a lot of there are a lot of workshops related to processing anger, expressing anger. So like there are this workshop where you literally leave where your voice and your throat is sore because you've been angry for an hour and you've been screaming basically. But it all builds up to this simulation of two tribes killing the father, and then there's this fire, this huge bonfire where the father is metaphorically killed, and they stage it so it looks like he's being burned, but then he's being pulled away, and whatever. And then after the whole weekend's done, everyone returns to their normal roles. But this is basically a virtual simulation of something which is hyper tribal.
Yeah.
And then finally, my last point is because I'm whenever I'm in these things, I'm kind of like an anthropologist in some sense. I'm in there, but I'm also being kind of anthropological because that was my original training. Basically, what I see when I look at these groups in terms of their own conceptual development and mediation is that they head towards some sort of structure that looks like a traditional religion.
Yes.
Like that's where they want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is something I get into with I have a chapter in my book on René Girard, because Girard is a great thinker of the religious and of the sacred, and he's an interesting reader of Freud, where he'll basically argue that Freud's theory of Oedipus is sound, is correct, but he'll give a completely different structural account for its emergence within cultural religious communities, which is in other words, he sees it as a structure linked to religious practices necessitating a scapegoat logic. So the father becomes the scapegoat in Girard's sense. It's not to be understood as somehow structurally intrinsic to the desiring system of our unconscious or anything like that. So he's worth looking at. If you read Violence in the Sacred, he elaborates 2 chapters, I think, on Freud there that I analyze. But I mean, I think the interesting thing, though, is that the task is not to treat one's own father as the father. This may be the danger of thinking that patriarchy, or conceiving of patriarchy too literally. It's rather to shift the father that you know in an empirical sense, to render their symbolic position as complicit within a system of domination. In essence, and this is where the kind of Marxist psychoanalytic fusion would happen, to engage in a process in which those symbolic positions and symbolic codes that we inhabit are revealed as shams. I mean, what that means is that the reason why to be a father is a humiliating lot in contemporary capitalism has nothing to do with one's own personal failures. I'm not successful enough. I'm not, I don't know, I don't have the right happiness quotient or the right body or something like this, right?
I just want to say, there's an empirical example of this. There's this funny meme that's going around where Jay-Z's daughter is humiliating him. Like she thinks he's uncool. But it's like Jay-Z. It's like how much more like culturally cool or like successful can you be? But his daughter's like, no, like get away from me.
That's so funny. Yeah. No, but I mean, but I guess, part of the task of a Marxist orientation here would be to reveal that, again, I think one of the things that Marxism really helps us understand is that capitalism can be known, right? This is kind of where Marx links to the tradition of the Enlightenment or to the tradition of rationalism, and why the concept of the totality is important, right? So a Marxist philosopher like Lukács will make an argument that the proletarian has a different grasp on the logic of the system. So I think the task would actually be something like that, would be that there's something liberating about bringing the father through the humiliation so that a grasp on the totality of the system could be achieved. Like perhaps you could think of Oedipus as this more politicized conception. I don't see why not. Now, I have a thinker that I would recommend here who tries to do this very thing. This thinker does not appear in my book, but this is a Che Guevarist Marxist Freudian based in Argentina, who is called Leon Rosichner, and he wrote this book called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. And this is basically his argument, where he says that, yeah, Freud argued that the father is a symbolic initiator of the social bond in the group psychology analysis of the ego. Many people have thought that Freud was trying to preserve a certain idea of patriarchy, and there's all kinds of different interpretations about that. But Rosichner gives a very sound interpretation for Marxism, which is, he says that yes, that's true, but the task is to bring the father out of the hold that what he calls the artificial bourgeois group or institution of the family imposes on them. In other words, the task is to initiate the father into a new possibility of revolution. And I think that that's where this question of the family and liberation ought to head, right? If we take the family as an inevitability, as a desire that, if you just look simply at public opinion polling, I don't mean to be too crude here, of people our age, millennial generation and younger, we still see that I think over almost 80% or higher, people say their life would not be complete unless they had kids. That fact alone is a fact that we must not push to the side. I think and nor must we then allow for this common narrative to emerge where we say, oh, well, you get married and you have kids, and then you kind of you turn away from politics, you turn away from being radical, that was just a part of your youth. I think that the enormity of social problems we have, from the ecological crisis to inequality to all of these different layers, race, a whole number of crisis points, we can't afford, our generation cannot afford to go through that same baby boomer arc of depoliticization. So how do we politicize these structures? That's the question. That's the question for me. And I think psychoanalysis really helps us in that if we read it right. And this Rosichner figure is somebody who really helps a lot there, because he's not giving a kind of anti-familialist argument. He's really helping me think how the family can actually be thought in a thorough and consistent liberatory way.
Yeah, again, there's many themes. For some reason, this stat that you're bringing up is something that might be worth expanding on a little bit, because what it's bringing to my mind, this idea that life is not for many people, life is not complete without family and kids, is that, you know, I was also teaching Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the main concept throughout that book to me is the spirit child. This idea of the you know, you go through the stages of the camel, the lion, and the child seems to me to be so central. But for Zarathustra, the child is obviously, you could think about a biological child, you could think about about the spirit child, as well as some sort of spiritual historical necessity within our development. And then it reminds me of some of these statistics I was reading from the history of Indian society, where basically there's two paths. Either you can do the mercantile path of having a family and being in everyday life, or you could go to the monastery and live a spiritual life. And the division between those two was about 80-20%. So I was wondering if like this 80-20% is like, for all of us, there is some tendency towards the metaphorical child, but there's some division about whether that spiritual tendency gets actually sublimated into a biological child, or whether that gets somehow transferred into a religious or a spiritual direction.
Well, this is a question that I think brings us back to the crisis of inequality, in the sense that, you know, today's elite have a kind of relationship to these questions where it's, for them, it's not an either or. People can be a hermit part of their life, they can raise 5 kids at another part, they can, you know, be a professor or a small business owner. There's this expansive sense that entrepreneurial capitalism has opened, but it's a bit of a frustrating homage to a liberation, right? It's a kind of limited one. And the limitation there, of course, has to do with class and inequality, which of course itself doesn't get named and can't be named directly, but nonetheless creates a kind of overarching frustration. So I think that you're right. I'm not prepared to say in a trans-historical sense that dynamic of 80-20 has always persisted. There could be some truth to that. That's an interesting thing to study. I'm not sure though. What I will say though is that perhaps for folks for whom the family has presented hurdles that are very sticky and hard to overcome, hard to transcend, one of the best remedies is to reproduce the family for oneself. That's not necessarily a narcissistic argument that, oh, you're having a family so that you can do a kind of glorified therapy for yourself. No, it's rather deeper than that, right? So if you have dealt with a family of divorce and trauma and separation and death and other challenges, having the opportunity to have children can be one of the most reparative and one of the most restorative avenues by which to heal family wounds. And I know that anecdotally, of course, but I think that this is something that we see also why the working class tends to be more, and this is a fact, they tend to be much more protective of family, desirous of family, and find in the meaning of family something qualitatively more significant than do bourgeois or middle class. That's just a kind of general fact. It's not always that way, but it is a tendency. So, you know, again, I don't think that these things need to necessarily be either or self-defeating, because I think that, I mean, speaking of Nietzsche, he's a case in point of a kind of new modern asceticism, which would insist that liberation actually cannot be fully achieved if one goes down that middle class path. Like, this is one of Nietzsche's kind of imminent critiques of bourgeois lifestyle. And that's actually one of the things when I was younger, I was very drawn to Nietzsche, thinking that he might be right. And I mean, as I now have children who are getting older and things of this nature, I feel that that's a bit of a myth, to be honest. You know, I mean, yeah, the sacrifice that's required to have children is immense, but I don't think that it has to be seen as something that will eradicate one's capacity to be an intellectual, to be a philosopher, etc. it's gonna take a lot of work, but I mean, just, I don't know where you're at on that, but
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because actually one of the things that I had a chance to meet Zizek in Ljubljana, and one of the things he said about Mladen Dollar is that he said Dollar's work actually improved and his productivity increased when he had children. So and also just
same
one
with
more
me. Same with me. Same with
right. So, and same with you. So I'd like to hear about that, but I just want to say one more touch point there is that I also have a close collaborator that was actually someone I met through this European Men's Network, who we were having basically a circling, and he was saying that far from an impetus to his creativity, he's a musician, far from an impetus to his creativity, he had a child, she's a year and a half old now. He said the child forced him to look at parts of himself that he wasn't looking at before he had a child, that has led to a far richer and more expansive notion of his creativity than he would have had without the child.
Oh, I mean, this is speaking my language. I mean, it's a there's so many layers here. I mean, I think there's the reparative thing of healing past generational rifts and bonds, that I'm not going to get into the specificities on that, but just the introduction of children will be perceived for a family environment in which you have traumas and splinters and difficult things that have occurred. The introduction of a new child in that milieu, in that environment, will tend to be perceived as a kind of as a bit of a miracle, right? And the healing capacity that they can provide in that situation can never be underestimated. So that's one point. I think that Dollar's experience and your friend's experience are very common, actually, which is there's a certain instrumentalized logic that you find in a lot of PMC or middle class thinking about kids, which is to basically treat kids as a burden to one's own free time or to one's own capacity for productivity. When in point of fact, I would contend that their existence in your life fills you with a certain reservoir and a surplus that can actually motivate in ways that you never thought that it would. So I don't mean to sound like a huge advocate here, but maybe I am sounding that way, which no, I'm not ashamed of it. I guess I am, but in essence, yeah, I think we have a lot of misnomers about that, and I think we need to remember that historically the family has been, and I think frankly still continues to be, one of the only sites where non-commodified value in itself can take place for individuals. Your family, if not all families, but in a ideal register, it's not going to judge you based on your performance, based on the means by which your acceptance, your full embrace, there's never going to be that kind of embrace from any other institution, right? So there's something there that I think is extremely powerful. On the flip side, and at the same time, that dependency that the family gives, which is basically a dependency of that Freud makes an argument, by the way. This is an incredible argument that a lot of people miss in group psychology. Makes an argument that the composition of the church and the army, what he calls the artificial groups, are structured on relations of infant dependency. In other words, they take on, their leadership structures are meant to replicate a similar familial passive dependency. In that sense, I think that Nietzsche and others are right to question bourgeois institutions as providing a kind of false dependence. So it's a bit of a paradoxical point, but there's two edges here. One is, does this make sense, right? There's this kind of,
I just think this is a very important point you're making.
Yeah, there's this capacity for the family to become a site of value in itself, non-commodified self-worth. Okay. Simultaneous to that, there's a capacity for the development of a passive subjectivity, which experiences possibly pre-Oedipal dynamics, experiences struggles with overcoming that very dependence. Right? Overcoming that becomes a challenge and a hurdle, which is related to this new structure of the paternal authority, which we were talking about, right? So it's a bit of a double bind. It's a bit of a double bind that the family initiates and imposes, that each of us we each have to develop some strategy for exit. So the family must be exited, but it must be exited well, and it must be exited thoroughly. That's Freud's point. And Freud, I think, would say that the psychoanalytic therapeutic approach is actually necessary to psychically fully perform that exit. So it's a double bind.
Yeah.
It's a complex situation.
You know, on there's so many points there that I want to get to, but you know, I guess starting with, again, sort of bringing it back into contact, I've seen in the last few years, and perhaps my proximity to men's work leads to this, is that I've seen firsthand the church and the army, either in a sort of neoliberal simulated form of the church and the army. I'm sure it was much different back in Freud's time, replicate these relations of infant dependency. That's such a powerful argument. And that's such a accurate description of what I've observed. And precisely what's at stake there, it does seem to me to provide potentially they're like vehicles or holding containers through which people are trying to exit the family without going to psychoanalytic therapy, basically.
Yeah.
Because both the situations of the church and the army artificial groups that I've seen is that both are very resistant to psychoanalytic therapy. And I maybe get a feedback from you, unless there's another point you wanted to make, is that I've seen very interesting patterns in who's interested in the subjects I teach, whether it's, say, Hegel or Nietzsche or Freud or psychoanalysis. They appeal to very different people, and they get resistances from different people. Mm-hmm. And the type of people who might be gravitating towards Hegel or Nietzsche could be resistant to psychoanalysis. At the same time, someone who's interested in psychoanalysis could be resistant to Hegel and so forth. But I've seen certain interesting stripes of people who are in these church and army environments who see psycho, or in general, I would say also right-leaning political people, be very resistant to psychoanalytic therapy. And I would be interested to know what you think about that, if you have similar experience.
Well, yeah. First of all, I think it's important to note that Freud's theory of the artificial groups encompasses the church and the army. But what I try to show is that we could extend these logics of paternal dependence, because what Freud is really giving us is a theory of class power, because we can call the artificial groups bourgeois groups, okay, through a concept of dependency. So that means also that the factory or the corporation similarly have a logic. If we can derive what I'm trying to do in future work, actually, I'm proposing a book on this, actually, is we can derive a theory of what a bourgeois institution is through this conception of dependency. Okay. Now, one way to look at it would be that what this calls for is a new theory of leadership, because within these artificial groups, church, army, let's also say corporation and workplace, if you read Freud's group psychology closely, you'll notice that he doesn't refer to the leaders of those groups as leaders. He refers to them as directors. They are directors. And he reserves the name of leader for the mass group or the revolutionary group, which is a breakoff from them, a rebellion from them, right? And Freud's very interested in those because he's writing the group psychology and analysis of the ego around the time of post-1917 Europe, which was experiencing things like the Spartacist uprising in Germany, 1922. So he's fascinated by the possibility of these breakaway outlaw groups, okay? Because they have a different structure of leadership. And their structure of leadership is not to keep each of the subjects tethered to a state of infant dependency, but it is rather to experiment and to push a different form of independence. I mean, it is interesting as a sort of proof of infant dependency. Why does military humor always tend to be so regressive, almost potty humor? Why is that the case, right? That kind of is a proof of Freud's argument in some sense, that there's something regressive. There's something regressive about that. And ultimately, the revolutionary group, and this is a political point, is going to treat the rational agency of each subject in a way which fosters more independence, which I think is what we're after ultimately. Therefore, the leader of a revolutionary group is going to be a figure who's going to constantly make evident the logic of the totality that keeps one tethered to these relations. So part of what I'm theorizing a revolutionary group to be doing is to be able to articulate the effects and the knowledge of what indoctrination and dependence is, and how it is experienced, and how it can be brought out and made revealed and made apparent. Because when you've done that, I think that you've identified a new theory of class power, going back to the class question. But this is a different element of class, by the way. It's completely different. And this is, I think, one area where Marx and Freud unite in a theory of bourgeois groups and in a critique of bourgeois groups, because I think Freud has an imminent critique of bourgeois groups, okay? So yes, so I think that this is quite radical to think that, now here's the interesting dimension here. You know, where does this leave the entrepreneurial society, right? The kind of Byung-Chul Han achievement society and hyper-individualism and all of that. Where does this leave? This is a big question for me. You know, the American view of freedom, and the American view of freedom tends to be opposed to bureaucracy, opposed to a corporate life. I don't want to be anyone's boss but my own boss, right? How might that, so then, you know, there's further work that needs to be done there. And I face the question of entrepreneurship as a hard reality of our present. I consider myself actually an entrepreneur. I mean, I'm doing a YouTube channel like you. I have a podcast. You know, I'm para-academic. I'm partially in the university. I'm partially outside of it. I have to do other things to support myself and my family. So it's a reality, right? But at the same time, in what ways does the entrepreneurial thing, and this is a problem of capitalism ultimately, still circle us back to relations of dependence, right? So I think any thinking about socialism or communism would have to address the question of dependency. And that is something that I really discovered in writing this book. You know, that's an epiphany that I had, that I didn't see Marxist Freudian thought focus on. And that kind of came out of this as in the last few chapters.
So there's so much there. And the first thing I want to say is that I really like this direction you're trying to go with the leader of the revolutionary group versus the leader of the artificial groups. So as a side note, the second anthology through Philosophy Portal was titled, and it's inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is titled Abyssal Arrows, Spiritual Leadership Inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the whole theme is leadership. And to me, the way I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra was on the one hand, the explicit message of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the overman is the meaning of the earth, but the implicit message of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is that Zarathustra is struggling with how to sacrifice himself to be a leader. And he's struggling with and he goes through specific struggles with what it means to be a revolutionary leader. And I think that model, I'm not saying it's the model we need to follow, but it certainly is a model where he's giving us sort of intimate information about what's at stake for the quote unquote revolutionary leader.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, I have a book coming out on Nietzsche, and I center Zarathustra throughout the book. And one of the things I'll say is that I and this is a bigger conversation, but I'll just say this briefly. I think that Nietzsche's Zarathustra also has a tendency, I argue, to produce a type of leadership which is runs a danger of producing what I call a sadomasochistic relationship to authority. It can. Maybe it doesn't have to always, but it can. And I think that there are some Nietzschean forms of community which, I mean, if you just think about the very conclusion of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and you'll remember the lion's roar that wakes up the overmen when they're asleep in the cave, right? And what happens? All of the overmen flee out of fear, and Zarathustra's left alone. And I think that I read that message as Nietzsche trying to say that each reader is never going to ascend to the heights of, like, Zarathustra remains kind of an uncastratable father in some sense. And I find that to be a bit of a problematic line. I mean, I see its seductiveness, but you see, because he's trying to maintain this continual competition amongst the overmen for arriving at or ascending to Zarathustra's status, for which, frankly, none of the overmen really ever can or will. So there's something about Zarathustra's status which I think can feed into that. And Sloterdijk, really, Peter Sloterdijk, points out the same thing in his incredible short book on Nietzsche. He says this is a limitation of Nietzsche, which is that Nietzsche can produce communities in which it's his followers, the followers will still sometimes tend to see themselves as losers because they're overmen, but not complete overmen, because it's not possible to be a complete overman, et cetera, et cetera. So I raise that as a question. Mm-hmm. I don't know what
it's an impossible idol. I know there's someone in the there's someone in the Philosophy Portal community. His name, and he wrote in the anthology. His name's Thomas Hamelrich. He's a professor actually of computer science, but his real interest is Girard. And he wrote an article in the anthology called Nietzsche's Tantra and Girard Sutra, where he basically argues that you can't just have Nietzsche on his own as a social paradigm, that he creates this impossible idol, and that you need some sort of mode of social prohibition, and he uses Girard.
That's fascinating, yeah, because, I mean, what Sloterdijk says is that you have the possibility, not always, but in many cases, of kind of incel communities forming off of this logic. And that's actually an interesting thing, which is one of the other things, going back to the artificial groups. And I'm not saying that Zarathustra's actually, and Nietzsche himself is interesting because he's such a rebel against the bourgeois institutions. The question is, he's a rebel against bourgeois institutions, but to what end? That's a whole other thing we could talk about.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
I just wanted to juxtapose in regards to the artificial groups, which I think is the important point I don't want us to lose, because we can critique, but I just don't want to lose this point, is that the point that I like that Zarathustra makes throughout is this distinction between followers and children, and that children are not followers. So like the difference between followers is that you create an artificial group where everyone's under one director, but to have children, to want children, is actually, you're not going to create an artificial group where everyone's under one director. You're going to create a situation where people, in some sense, are trying to find their own independence away from you.
Right. No, that's very good. No, that, I mean, I think that there, again, this is a good example of the subtlety of Nietzsche's corpus, which allows for this multiplicity of readings. Of course, I'm open to that.
I
But
also wanted to say one more thing, that
yeah,
he's explicitly in the speeches of Zarathustra, to me, he's trying to point towards some path beyond the market and the state,
yep.
but he's not against having a family.
Mm,
Like, he's not against it. He says have a family, you know, and even have like a wedding, have a and have it be the family pointing for the overman. So he's not against the family, but he is against the, like, he is trying to point away from or beyond the market and the state, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a question there around a theory of leadership from Zarathustra that I would um, characterize as also requiring, kind of at all times, the imminent replication and reintroduction of distinctions of strength and weakness, and kind of distinctions of not necessarily of hierarchy, but of rank, that when brought into capitalist milieus have certain negative effects on the theory of leadership. That's something that I criticize in Nietzsche, but only insofar as how Nietzsche latches onto Marx. Like, the cocktail of Nietzsche and Marx doesn't always go that well. And yeah, I try to show you like this examples of how it goes and things of that nature. And then Sloterdijk actually says that Ralph Waldo Emerson gives a better model of leadership for fostering independence than does Nietzsche's Zarathustra, because in Emerson, it's not about adhering to an uncastratable authority figure who's whatever. It's around nonconformity in a very thorough and radical sense. So there's actually not really a leader. It's this kind of spirit of constant nonconformity and so on, and experimentation. And that's why he says that Sloterdijk argues that this is why Nietzsche is actually limited, in some sense, and also why Nietzsche has at times attracted the right, because of this sense. And I think you see this in a lot of breakaway right-wing groups, where they need an leader figure who's unquestionable, a genius, even despite them not being a genius and making grave errors. So there's something about left-wing groups, rebellious groups, that needs the question of leadership to be constantly thought. I'm not sure that Nietzsche is the best for that. There's a lot of indications of interesting directions. But I mean, in general, I think that this conversation is very powerful, because I guess what you could say is that a socialist conception of the institution of the family would have to be one that fortifies itself against the replication of a social order. Like, if the family is the centrifugal point, the reflective point, the mirror in which relations of dependency replicate themselves in churches, armies, corporations, etc., right? That actually means that socialist society would have to start with a much more liberated family structure. And when you do, then that replication mirroring process will also result in institutions that have healthier forms of authority. That would be an argument that I would make. And that's actually an argument as to why repressive families give us repressive institutions all the way down. And I mean, it's no surprise when you travel to former Soviet countries today, all of the baby boomer generation, I mean, it's the inverse of the West. They all want that back, right? And I think part of the reason they want that back is because the welfare state affordance that socialism gave such more stability to the family that it increased the health of institutions across the board. So that's actually an argument for socialist stability to the family, because I mean, that's another thing that the left can't talk about or doesn't talk about, which is, how do we understand the perpetuation of forms of social violence as a result of the breakdown of family structures? it's obvious, but there's no, unless you're religious, you're not really permitted to talk about that. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to ask you that next was the disc. You make a point about one of the problems probably since the Cultural Revolution, or not the Cultural Revolution, but like the counterculture and the new left of the 60s and 70s, is that you have this structure where there's kind of this situation where on the one hand you could have right-leaning politics talking about a return to a traditional family, and then you have the left, which is sort of unable to talk about family, or there's more of emphasis on the abolition of the family, and the consequences of that leading to a situation where the only family structures we have are under a model of repression of desire, and as opposed to a more liberatory model. Is what do you think about this, and what's a way for us to break this relationship between leftist and rightist politics and the family?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the definition of individualism in the neoliberal era has an unthought complicity to familial structures, right? So you are thought and treated as an individual agent of human capital production and value making, of course, but you're also thought at the nexus of your own family resources to stabilize that process for you. So you're sort of thought externally as an individual, but there's this unthought network that props you up as that. And putting aside all of the questions about the inequality of the resources question of who has access to paternal networks of gift exchange and what the leisure that would allow and the access that would allow, putting that question to the side for a moment, I think what we'd have to re-envision the social link, like if in Lacan's discourse theory, where he says that capitalism erodes social bonds and links, I think it's possible to re-envision a conception of collective individualism through a new commitment to the family, because in reality, the old ideals of the bourgeois family are gone now, right? There's no representative political body that really stands for the integrity of the equality of the family rights. Those are kind of gone now. I mean, my favorite example is that even highly conservative neoconservatives, they will argue that women should be treated just as men, as units of labor time, of laboring individuals all throughout their life. I mean, the whole notion of a kind of welfare state retirement that is completely off the table. So there's this kind of erosion of market logics into the value spheres on both the right and the left in such a way that there's no possibility for a unified commitment to the preservation of family rights. And by family rights, I mean primarily the leisure time afforded to family members for the cultivation of their own capacities and health and so on. So like that might become a site for political demands. And that's where I am interested in the politics of leisure time. So politics of leisure time being something where you could have a kind of socialist politics reemerge that would point out the fact that both the right and the left cannot speak to this because they're so caught up in capitalist imperatives. That might be a healthy avenue by which, because I'm also somebody that believes, unlike many people on the far left, that we need a socialist party that would go in and vie for resurrecting the dignity of socialism and engaging in elections and so on, but not as a bourgeois party, but as a socialist party with a socialist vision. That we haven't seen that really in our lifetime, but I think we should try to build it, in my view. And part of that would be a new conception of the family would have to be part of it.
So in regards to this new conception of the family, so tied to leisure time, is there something at work here between the paradox of the family you bring up in the book between our thinking about the family as private and sealed off versus the public as social reproduction. I mean, you already sort of brought it up, and I thought you brought it up well with this idea that in neoliberalism, we're treated as individual agents of human capital. But what's not thought is this unthought network that functions as a background there. So we create this, perhaps maybe you'd say, maybe not, artificial distinction between the private and the public. But what's at stake here with the new conception of the family? And does the tension in leftist politics and philosophy between the Deleuze and Guattari notions of repression and desire play a role as it relates to the new left in the 1960s and 1970s? Because you do bring up Deleuze and Guattari on the repression and desire, and also recentering Oedipus, making Oedipus political. Is there a relation there with the tendency to anti-Oedipal conceptions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, part of the logic of neoliberalism, and there's been a fair amount written on this, is that neoliberalism as a kind of reigning, you see neoliberalism is a kind of pragmatics. It only works when one opts into and becomes complicit in reproducing its logic, but it forces each subject to that each subject must embrace its pragmatics, right? So that's a kind of oppressive dimension, and part of that also is a highly antisocial dimension of the neoliberal perpetuation of social life. And so we have the emergence of an antisocial left, and by that what I mean is that we're witnessing now the sense in which because neoliberalism functions on the premise that there is no alternative to its force of constant labor routines, through its entrepreneurial focus, through its gutting of social services and putting the weight of the absence of social services and welfare provisions onto the backs of family members, of agents of human capital, etc. What that actually means is that you have takeover a kind of survivalist necessity on behalf of each and every one of us, which prevents us from even having the time to envision and enact and create alternatives to this, where you could carve out a new sphere where you have a politicized conception of the collective common good. Instead, what you have is these antisocial tendencies kind of envelop the left, and you have a kind of a hyper destructive ethics emerge, where the task is basically a kind of quite anarchic vision. I myself think that socialism needs to craft out large-scale recommitment to redistributive, like we need on the one hand not a nostalgia to return to the kind of Fordist breadwinner family structure and all of that. It's not possible. But at the same time, we need to reintroduce a new desire for basic provisions having a fundamental equality return. Neoliberalism has trained each of us to hate equality and to find inegalitarian possibilities the source of something that holds us down.
Would you say
it holds us down?
This has come up in some of my talks. I just want to get your stance on it. Does this point in the direction of some sort of new social contract? And if yes, does that new social contract involve something related to either basic income or some sort of funding for the family as such? Like, does that play a role? Like, that you get some sort of economic benefit if we're going to play under the rules. The logic would be, if we're going to play under the rules of neoliberalism, does getting married and having children, does that need to be in some sense subsidized or economically helped?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, if we're thinking revolution vis-a-vis, as we were saying earlier, this mode of production, and we're um, fundamentally challenging the core movement and logic of capital distribution of wealth, what we're talking about is the introduction of new sources of commonwealth in which one's labor and one's compensation and one's relationship to private property and ownership of companies would have to be fundamentally re-envisioned, but not on a vision of austerity and on a vision of scarcity. I think the challenge is that we haven't really seen anti-capitalist politics get off the ground. This is part of the reason why I think class is important, because the left hasn't really experienced what it truly means to take on capitalist power. When you do, you have things like a capital strike, where the ruling class tries to squeeze you and punish you for challenging its hegemony. We have now most forms of revolt and rebellion on the left not addressing the capital labor nexus. What would it look like if politics were to do so? We would have a completely different conception of politics. It would be night and day. I'm advocating that we're in a pre-political situation. We're not in a political situation today. What you're talking about is kind of way down the line. And I would say those decisions, I mean, Marx, upon witnessing the Paris Commune of 1871, made him an interesting argument, which he said that the first task of revolution should be the introduction of compulsory free time for the working class, so that the working class may have the time to begin to think about what collective decision-making would look like on their terms. That's the first task. So the task is not to have the answer. Like Zizek says, oh, the problem with Occupy was nobody had any answers. Well, no, the reason we didn't have any answers is because we are oppressed in this system. And we need, one of the problems with the pandemic, by the way, is we were given a lot of free time, but on the terms set by the ruling class, not by us. One way to think about what revolution would look like would be that an achievement of free time for the working class that's achieved by working class power. That's going to mean something qualitatively different than these kind of quasi-UBI distributions that happened during COVID. So that's why I think things like working class power, labor power matter, because it's about politicizing and helping people see that their agency could actually be catalytic to fundamentally changing the distribution of wealth. You're not going to change the distribution of wealth through UBI. You're not going to change the distribution of wealth through having really educated, Harvard, smart people taking over government. If that was true, it would have happened a long time ago. They're not interested in that. The only way you're really going to do that is have working class power from below, build these things up. But you have to do that by having some kind of successes. We haven't had many successes. So, we need to regroup. We need to regroup and start more modestly. But I mean, I know I'm not answering your question. But I mean, I would say that.
Well, in some sense, you answered the question by saying we're actually in pre-political times and that these questions would be for a political situation, not a pre-political situation, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of a punting of your question, but I think that would be my response, is that your question necessitates a punt. It cannot, yeah, to use a football metaphor, like I'm going to punt it. Because we would have to, because if we are too premature there, I mean, then we end up, I mean, I think one of the problems with UBI, okay, is the problem of dependency. Okay, going back to the artificial groups, problem of dependency, Oedipus 101. I mean, I was just recently in the Middle East, and I was in a country which the working class has, because of they have an economic crisis in Lebanon. They have an economic crisis, and the working class they have a fundamentally dependent relationship from diaspora donations from family members overseas. And one of the effects of that practically is that it seems to mostly wipe out all of their agency. So I think the challenge with UBI is that that's what it does. And that's cunning on behalf of bureaucracy. They kind of want that. They want to pacify population. So I am for the kind of politicization, not the pacification. And I think that UBI pacifies the working class. I'm for kind of the development of working class power, you know, and you know, in the Marxist philosopher Lukács's view, Lukács says that the working class doesn't really begin to see itself as a class. You know, this famous dialectic of the in itself and the for itself. That doesn't start until the working class has achieved something on its own terms, right? That's when the dialectic starts. So I really think we need to go back to kind of the drawing board and think along those lines. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that basically there's a lot that the working class needs to think through in more of an independent mindset than a mindset of dependency. And that if we just think in terms of UBI, if we think in terms of creating new dependencies, we're creating new Oedipal relationships instead of really creating a situation where we can think through things in an independent mindset.
Well, I think so. I think that's right. But I would say mindset is still only partially what it is, because it's really more of a subjectivity. It's a subjective dependence, and subjective here referring to something beyond just mind dependence, right? This is talking about unconscious levels of desire, other levels of dependence that go deeper than just mind dependence. So that's, I think, one of the beauties of the Oedipal theory of dependence, which is it's around unconscious attachments of one's own desire that have to be worked through. So it ups the ante on dependence. If it was just as easy to say that it was mindset dependence, then I think then the task would be easier, if that makes sense. So
Yeah,
I think, if that makes sense.
I would just say, for example, if I was thinking about this, is like the degree to which, and this is coming from just a personal self-reflective example, is the degree to which academics or intellectuals would like to have sort of a dependence on the bourgeois state in regards to academic positions or something like that you put, like, for example, and this is an interesting tension I'd like to actually work through with you, because it's maybe coming at it from a similar place. Is like, we mentioned the artificial groups of the church, and the army, but you also mentioned the bourgeois sort of dependences of say academic life, maybe creating a false dependence.
Right.
Is,
well, I mean,
and then on the other hand, we have the double bind of the entrepreneurial path. And like, I think this is a really difficult thing to think through, because on the one hand, I don't think everyone can be an entrepreneur. I don't think everyone should be an entrepreneur. I don't think that's a model that we could even universalize. So are we in this situation where we've got to sort of basically walk a line between, on the one hand, state dependency, on the other hand, entrepreneurial market experiments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Marx is, I would follow Marx's scattered reflections on what communism might entail when he mentions that it would have to involve the liberty for a multiplicity of experimentations in one's own occupation. And I think it's interesting, if you look at what the contemporary ruling class is composed on, that's exactly what they do. For example, the Clintons are writing novels, they are philanthropists, they are heads of state, they are entrepreneurs, they are charity leaders, XYZ. They can go start a farm if they wish. Society in a socialist vision would have to concoct the means to make that type of experimentation as close to universally accessible as possible, without putting forward a conception based on a kind of rigid dichotomy based on overestimating one's own abilities and creating exclusions based on that. So that maxim to each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, would be leaving room for ability and the honest and real difference that is real from the fact that people have differences in strength and aptitude and intelligence and art and so on and so on. The question, I think, is more of a people also mature at radically different paces, right? And the current system we have is a kind of Hunger Games in which one's destiny is decided in a highly limited period of time, with all of these unthought benefits and resources going to some and not going to others. So that would also have to be addressed. I mean, we'd have to rethink so many different layers of this. But I mean, I think one of the areas in which we have to start, and this is a big debate that I have with Nietzsche, is I believe that we need to redefine equality, not abolish equality. I think Nietzsche is more on that line. And this is a big schism that I have with him on the question of equality, because I think that equality in capitalism is highly elusive, and capitalism actually wants us to abolish equality. It sort of trains us that equality is not natural, when I think that it is. Anyways, that's a bigger thing. But
well, I just want to emphasize the point that you started with, which is that Marx's scattered reflections on, and that's very helpful to think, I think, that Marx's scattered reflections on communism is that we would have to have a certain liberty for a multiplicity of experimentations in one's occupation. And I have absolutely no problem with that. I actually do that. However, what makes that so difficult is the anxiety of the social, of no social net, or no, of basically feeling like a risk could be a catastrophic or fatal risk, that there's no, like, and so the I don't know if my idea is, it's not even a strong idea, it's just the idea I had would be, and it's not even an original idea, I think many people have this idea, is that something like a UBI would provide a ground, an equal ground for people to then, now this is a positive conception of human creativity, that people would naturally tend towards what you're saying, that if there was a UBI, not in a pandemic condition, that people would naturally try to experiment with a multiplicity of different ways of building one's occupation and generating a deeper livelihood. Or
yeah, I mean, I think if you had that combined with a opening of the books and a rendering of a transparent of the allocation of surplus, right, in such a way that allows for the recognition distribution question, right, which is this question of like, oh, okay, well, does the Wall Street executive going to feel adequately compensated for their working 15 hours a day and their insane drive, that it be compensated adequately in socialism? Well, I mean, I think the answer would be that socialism would compensate them, but not to this level for which the negative effects, right, are going to be what we witness today in American cities. And so there has to be a different treatment of the surplus. There also has to be a cultural revolution in values, transvaluation of values that occurs, such that that thymotic, to use a Fukuyama's term, that thymotic drive of the entrepreneur, of the Nietzschean overman in all of its irrational drives, right, can be satiated through a commitment to a common good. Yeah. Right now, that satiation of their drive, as you know, has no necessity or fundamental link back to something common. I think that the socialist position would be that you can have irrational drives, fine. Sure, some people need that, that's great, fine. But we're going to ask you to shift your value sphere towards something more collective in that. And I think, again, this brings us back to Nietzsche, because I'm not sure that Nietzsche would agree with this notion that it's possible to have a kind of, I don't know, a collective good or something like this, right? Anyways, that's a bigger debate. I think we should have that conversation when you hopefully check out my book on this. But
oh yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that. And just so the viewers know, I mean, these questions and the structure of this interview so far, we've only covered the first 3 chapters of the book so far, really.
we haven't really talked about the super ego, but I mean, I know we're almost at time, but
yeah,
in the future we'll have to do that.
I think we'll have to focus on the superego, another time. But I do want to get to that, and I mean, we did talk a lot about authority, leadership, the breakdown of social authority and leadership. We did get into a little bit of initiation and the crisis of initiation, but we can go deeper into that. I think the last sort of question I want to ask you before we start to close is that you emphasize, I think this is huge, and so many people, myself included, have brought this up as almost like a master signifier of the crisis of the social, is the collapse of trust and the collapse of commitment to the social as such. And I think you already brought that up in regards to, like, for example, the family as a haven in a heartless world, but now we have an unloving society where people are not just abandoning love altogether. And just want to say here, if the new left of the 60s brought us the sexual revolution, do we need the love revolution, as cheesy as that sounds, in some sense, starting with not a cheesy love, but not even just a pure open love, but a love that does have some grounding with the family?
No, it's a really nice point you make on trust, because I think that in a sense there's a topsy-turvy nature to contemporary society apropos normativity, which is why you see these strange phenomena of, like, why the alt-right is punk, for example, and like why the avant-garde is not political anymore, whereas it used to be. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, to be anti-normative, to be against conventions, was subversive and therefore politicized. Well, now everybody can be kind of anti-normative. It's so therefore, in a paradoxical sense, the most politicized position one can take would be to kind of step beyond some of these ossified status quo versions of thinking about politics and re-envisioning politics anew. That's why the whole class thing is important to me. It's why a new conception of the family is important to me. So I feel that there is a sense in which, yes, we need to have a really rigorous historical analysis on, because if we have kind of reached the kind of dead end of what we know as the middle class or bourgeois family, where all of its promises are kind of dead weight, they don't really have any efficacy, which I think is kind of where we're at in some sense. How do we transition out of that? So in that sense, I feel that it's like a kind of almost like a virginal opportunity for redefinition. But what's important in that redefinition is that we really clarify what went down historically. For example, when the New Left tried the communes, when the New Left tried to abolish families, when the New Left, some positive things came from that, right? Like right now, after the Supreme Court decided for marriage equality, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I wrote an article for Ion magazine recently where if you are a homosexual, if you have a homosexual marriage, you are way more likely to say that the rationale for why you got married had everything to do with a bond of love. Whereas that's not the case in a heterosexual marriage. So what that indicates is, in a sense, the sexual revolution kind of has succeeded, but on the terms set by Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal economic wasteland. So we have this egalitarian ideal promise that can be lived out if you have the money to do it. It's like the bourgeois family exists in a very rare form today. And I think part of the struggle and the strife and the social conflict that we have is the fact that and this is one thing we haven't talked about, it takes a lot of resources to reproduce a family and to create the conditions for a happy family, which, you know, the whole mystique of the happy family, which kind of emerges in the 1940s and 50s as the nuclear family, the breadwinner family gets introduced, right? That whole idea. You should ask yourself, like, what does that mean today to have a happy family? It's hard. In a sense, it's not the stakes have risen purely out of economic things. So the sexual revolution has delivered a lot, but it's done so in a domain where the economic revolution and the material question has not been adequately addressed, right? So I feel that that's the simple priority that, if I haven't mentioned it enough in this interview, I just want to reiterate that a lot of it is this kind of simple material thing, because what was achieved in the sexual revolution in terms of the values is actually quite positive, in my opinion, especially speaking now as somebody who kind of comes from a kind of conservative background. And I was just talking to somebody the other day from a Christian background, and the fact that Christians are still dealing with these debates over LGBTQ inclusion is so silly. It's so symptomatic of kind of literally like the tragedy of contemporary Christianity, that's still a question, you know? So, you know, I guess the sexual revolution has done a lot, but it's also, we have to have a different positionality to it. We can't blindly repeat what they did, because they didn't address the class economic issue. They didn't address it adequately. They achieved something at a level of values and ideals, but they made the family exclusive, and only few can now attain it in a basic sense. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and it brings up a point that even makes me want to keep the conversation going, and basically on this topic and in regards to the book and how lucid you are. I could talk to you about this for a couple more hours because there's just endless numbers of questions that come. But you know, the point you made there about the homosexual marriage having the rationale to do with the bond of love, where the heterosexual marriage maybe not the case anymore, where you already stated earlier in our talk that back however many decades, it wouldn't be the case that people would choose a marriage partner based on class as much or utilitarian ends, whereas in the current, what's often called the manosphere,
Yeah.
one of the principal concerns in the manosphere is this reduction to utilitarian concerns. But to be fair, it goes both ways, where it feels like a lot of people are being instrumentalized for conventional sexual markers of attraction, like whether that's breadwinner, whether that's being a CEO. Like there's all these videos about women being asked what's the ideal income for a man, and they're like $100,000. There's this podcast where there are women who say, I won't even date a man unless he had $100,000 a year income. And so this is getting normalized in the discourse, but also the instrumentalization also goes the other way, with men saying, oh, I want to have a much younger wife, or a very beautiful wife, and I won't settle for anything less, or I want to have a harem of women even. So there are these tendencies which are coming up in a context where we don't have trust in society, where we don't have a meaningful social contract, where we don't have any long-term conception of what adulthood is, where all of these very base markers are being emphasized and highlighted.
Yeah. Well, also the fact that, you know, what that indicates from the early anecdotal survey results of it was working class men and women that decided to marry predominantly, but it was also cross class. Let's say just in general, let's just say in general marriage. That's part of the reason why, by the way, when you had non-assertive marriage across class, you could kind of say there's one conception of the family. But my argument now is that we're kind of seeing two different forms of the family, by the way. But anyways, I like to call it a bond of disinterest, a bond of disinterest. And that's actually highly liberatory as a form of love, because love, in my view, is the most non-instrumental, the most disinterested bond. I mean, you know, this whole concept of disinterest. Like, why did George Washington refuse to serve office for an extended period of time and go on and become a farmer? It's because, well, he had this whole notion of disinterest. Like, I think something similar like that is part and parcel of the love bond, but that neoliberal era that we live in has deprived us of that. And I think this is something that a socialist society must reintroduce. And that itself will lower the temperature on the anxiety and the social intensity of our lives when you don't have to pressure people so much, where it's not so onerous, where you're not seeing your possible life partner in the same framework. That would be positive.
Well, I think that maybe let's end things on a positive note. We've discussed a lot about psychoanalysis and the politics of the family today, and like I want to reemphasize, it's mostly been a focus on just the opening 3 chapters. What I would say is there are sort of tentative plans. Let's span this out and have some more conversations about it. I'm certainly open to it. But as it regards to the first conversation, is there any sort of last remarks or summary reflections that you'd want to leave the viewer with before we close up?
Oh, well, I want to thank you for giving me this space to freely associate. I mean, this, you know, we often forget that psychoanalysis is the art of free association. And I feel that this is what, in a highly creative way, we've been able to do here. And furthermore, every time I talk to people like you and people that take the work seriously, you know, a lot exceeds merely what was written. And so in that sense, the book is more of an invitation to co-thinking, to kind of a new form of thinking together. So that's what this conversation has represented to me, and that's very valuable. So thank you, and thanks for taking it seriously. I feel that this is hopefully valuable for people who are considering whether they themselves are willing to do a family, considering it, you know, that whole question, right? You know, it now is presented to us as a question, which, as I said before, there was a certain time in our life, say our parents, maybe even our grandparents especially, where that wasn't even processed in an instrumentalized way. We now live in a world where we have to relate to it that way. And so perhaps one of my arguments would be that we have to participate in the active reinvention of that social bond back to a point of disinterest, because it's more reflective of a question of what love is, right? Almost in, I don't know, in like a in a sense that is, I don't know, there's a whole ontological question there that it's opened. I don't know. But no, this has been great, and I hope we can continue for a part 2 very soon.
Absolutely. Like I said, every time you say something, it opens up some threads where I could keep going. So let's at least do a part 2 on psychoanalysis in the family. And I just want to say, for everyone watching, there'll be links in the description to Daniel Tutt's book, as well as his homepage, if you want to learn more about his work and check out the book for yourself. I highly recommend it. And I think the idea of bringing psychoanalysis together with politics and the family is something that's very in line with the direction of the teaching at Philosophy Portal. Like I mentioned throughout the conversation, in teaching what is sex, bringing together the question of the sexual to the political was something that tried to highlight. And I think Daniel Tutt's doing something similar here by bringing the question of psychoanalysis and politics to the family, which is, I think, a very synergistic effort. So with that being said, I will sign off from here and thank everyone for watching, and have a great evening.